So let's get started on the red cards. I'm going to kind of skip over all these Arcbound cards. These all mostly feel like plants for limited. Nothing particularly exciting going on with any of these. Bloodbraid Marauder is a card that requires you to jump through like several hoops, but can also enable some broken things to happen. So it's a 2-mana 3/1 that can't block, and it has Delirium, which requires you to have... Basically, it has Cascade if you have Delirium. So it's like it either has both mechanics or neither mechanics going. So Delirium says it wants you to have 4 different kinds of cards in your deck, or sorry, in your graveyard. So, it could be any combination of, the types of cards that exist, right? Instant sorcery, planeswalker, artifact, blah, blah, blah. So as long as you have any 4 different kinds of cards, it then has Cascade. And of course, Cascade says when you cast this card, first Cascade, which is to say reveal cards off the top of your library until you reveal a card that costs less than the source card. So this would be either a 1 mana or 0 mana card. And then you get to cast that card without paying its mana cost before this card resolves. So the obvious sort of combo here is, even in this set alone, and in other sets as well, there are all of these suspend cards, which have no mana cost, and therefore cost 0 in effect. And they're usually very powerful effects, right? Anything from Ancestral Recall to Wheel of Fortune to the more recently shown, Demonic Tutor one or the Bribery one or whatever. And you can cast those cards for 0 if you've built your deck in such a way that the guaranteed hits are going to be those cards. Now, of course, it's tricky, right? Because again, if nothing else, your deck probably has a Soul Ring in it, and this will cascade into a Soul Ring, which, to be fair, is not a bad thing. But if you want it to cascade into one of your 0-drop cards, guaranteed, you do have to build your deck in such a way where you don't have other options. But because it is such a low-costed card, it really does narrow the amount of options you have in terms of cascading, which means you can actually create a sort of a cascade package relatively easily, as long as you've already, jumped through the hoop of enabling Delirium. It's a lot of cards. It does a lot of things. It says a lot of stuff. It wants you to do a lot of things, but it is a powerful effect if you build towards it. Whether or not you want to do so is a separate question. But anything with the word Cascade on it needs to be looked at, because Cascade is a very, very strong mechanic. We're going to move on from past that. Nothing else on this looks like it's commander worthy, in my opinion. Okay, we've got some cards here. First one out is Bray as Apprentice. So, of course, this is a riff on Bray herself. Being a 4-mana 4/4 that makes 2 Thopters when she enters the battlefield and has a variety of pay 1 generic mana, sack some artifact effects. So this is like kind of half of Bray in a lot of different ways. So rather than being a 4-mana 4/4, it's a 3-mana 2/3. Rather than giving you 1 Thopter or 2 Thopters, it gives you 1 Thopter. And then rather than being pay 1 generic and sack 2 artifacts, it's tap and sack 1 artifact. So it is requiring less of you, but also requiring it to be able to tap. So you don't get to do it right away. You got to wait a turn. And this time, rather than Bray's abilities, it gives you the choice of 2 things. Either target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn, or, which is kind of whatever, or exile the top card of your library until the end of your next turn. You may play that card. And that ability is actually pretty reasonable. You do have to sack an artifact in order to do that, but again, it doesn't have to be the Thopter it made, though it can be. It can actually also sacrifice itself, notably. So that is worth remembering as well. But yeah, the ability to get to play the top card of your library until the end of the next turn, which means you don't have to do it this turn. You do get to wait a whole extra turn cycle if it's more useful later, is not unreasonable. I don't think it's good, but I also don't think it's bad. I think it's a serviceable card and you'll know if you want it, but I think it's a little clunky and a little slow, in my opinion, to really make it in Commander. But I would not fault anyone for playing it. Calibrated Blast is a meme. I don't think this card is real, so you can read it yourself later if you want, but I don't think this card makes any sense in any format that I can think of. Like, it's a weird situational removal spell that's, like, difficult to make work properly. Sometimes it's going to be very, very flashy, and sometimes it's going to do, like, nothing. So, I'm not a big fan of those high variance cards, personally. Speaking of high variance cards, so Captain Ripley Vance is a 3-mana 3/2 legendary creature pirate, human pirate, sorry. It says whenever you cast your third spell each turn, put a 1/1 counter on Captain Ripley Vance, then it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So basically, the first time you trigger this, you're going to put a counter on Ripley. It's going to be a 4/3, and it's going to deal 4 damage to any target, which is a good ability. But it requires you to cast 3 spells every single time you want this to happen, which is, in my opinion, a lot of hoops to jump through. Now, I've gotten into some debates on Discords and Twitters with people about whether or not this card is good. A lot of people think this card is really good. I think it is fine. I think it is probably better than I initially gave it credit for. I initially just sort of had it labeled as a win more card where, like, well, if you're already casting 3 spells a turn, you're probably doing fine for yourself. And I do believe that that remains largely true. But the payoff is real. The payoff is not just marginal extra stuff. Like, dealing 4, then 5, then maybe 6 damage if it's stuck around all this time is pretty powerful. That's going to start picking off real creatures or planeswalkers or just chunking your opponent for, like, non-negligible amounts of damage. I still ultimately think that it is asking for a lot of setup cost for, like, a good effect, but not a great effect. And I think that, like, it's fine, but I'll be curious to see what this card does in Commander. I have my reservations, but I'm also very ready to be proven wrong. So I'll leave it at that. So they used literal actual chef's kiss as the name on a Magic card. And as much as I love that, I am a little bit disappointed that this is the card that got the name Chef's Kiss, because it's not really Chef's Kiss. It's a fine card. It's an amusing card. It's not a very good card, and I'm kind of sad that the name Chef's Kiss is now forever tied to this, and they can't use it for any other card ever. 1 and 2 red, instant, gain control of target spell that targets only a single permanent or player, copy it, then reselect the targets at random for the first spell. The new targets can't be you or a permanent you control. So basically, the idea, it's a weird riff on, oh my goodness, there's a 4-mana card that does something similar. I'm, like, completely forgetting it at the moment, unfortunately. It's a decent card. But basically, this is like somebody targets your creature with a removal spell or something, and then you cast Chef's Kiss, and instead you so they target your spell. I'm, like, having trouble explaining this because it's very odd in how it works. So let's name actual cards for the sake of expediting this process. Your opponent casts Lightning Bolt, targeting your Solemn Simulacrum. You cast Chef's Kiss in response. What winds up happening is that it makes a copy of Lightning Bolt, and then it takes both the original Lightning Bolt and the copy of the Lightning Bolt and sends them both elsewhere at something that isn't you or your stuff. And so, as a result, you don't wind up getting targeted by anything, and then 2 random other things that you don't control get targeted by that spell instead. So you're redirecting it and copying it, but you still have no actual agency over where any of it goes, other than the safety net of knowing it's not going to target you. So it's like, it's kind of a fun, memey, splashy, silly effect, and it's probably going to create a lot of really, like, amusing, memorable moments in Commander, and I think it's a great card in that sense. But it's also the kind of card that I don't personally like playing, and so I'm a little bit lower on it than maybe others are, just because I don't like that sort of random nonsense chaos stuff. Like, I want my cards to do the thing. And this does something, but what it does is completely up to chance. I do, however, have friends in my play group that I know are going to be all over cards like this because they love that kind of stuff. It's just not for me. But I do think it's a cool card. I just don't think Chef's Kiss is the right name for it because it has nothing to do with food. So I don't really understand why. Like, I don't get the flavor of this card. Even the flavor text, cooked to perfection. Like, I don't really understand, like, why the redirection and copying. I don't understand what it has to do with the flavor. The name and flavor do not fit what the card does. It almost feels like they put it on the wrong card by accident. I'm confused. But it is a cool card. It's just bad flavor. Maybe that's the joke. Maybe the joke is that it's bad flavor, and that's flavorful because it's about a chef that makes terrible food. Maybe that's the whole freaking joke, and it's just like a meta joke in a joke. I don't know, but either way, here we are. Moving on. Dragon's Rage Channeler, I think, is actually an interesting card. Only because it is a Surveil card. I might be going too deep on that other one. I don't know. I'm not sure yet. I like Dragon's Rage Channeler because it is a Surveil trigger in red, which peeves me in the sense that, like, it's taunting the Surveil players that want more tribal Surveils, like more support for the Surveil mechanic in their actual black-blue decks where the mechanic is based. But it is a really cool effect for red to have the ability to mill cards into your graveyard if that's a thing you're interested in doing. I've got a friend who's already talked about putting this in a deck of theirs. I'll be curious to see if this winds up being good. It's a weird, neat little unique cog piece, and it's about as cheap as a Magic card can get, short of just being literally free. I'll be curious to see if this card winds up being good. I'm definitely intrigued by it. Faithless Salvaging is basically a slap in the face to anybody that wishes Faithless Looting wasn't banned in Modern, but also it's not a card that I am very interested in at all because it is just a bad Faithless Looting on multiple axes. It breaks it into two pieces and charges you twice the price. So it's really just like a double whammy of like, wow, Faithless Looting was a really good card, wasn't it? They literally made a card called Fast and Furious, which I do find amusing. Both effects are actually pretty reasonable. They're obviously both overcosted individually, but they're overcosted because you're getting the flexibility of getting either effect for a single card. So it's either an overcosted draw spell where it's discard a card, then draw two cards. Sorry, this is sideways, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm also reading it sideways if it makes you feel any better. But yeah, so the fast side is discard a card, then draw two cards. So you're essentially just trading two cards for two cards. But you have to like throw a card away, then get new cards before you know what you're getting, which is like pretty classic red impulsive draw. Or rummaging, I suppose, is like the general term for that. And then Furious is 5 mana to deal 3 to each creature without flying. So it's like a small earthquake effect for 5 mana. So it's an overcosted earthquake. But it is still and it's set at 3 no matter what. But it is, like I said, a very flexible card between the two modes that it has. Flare Blitz is actually a really interesting card. Again, for 1 mana, any card that costs 1 mana is going to pique my interest because it's cheap enough that like you're not paying a lot in terms of like trying to fit this into your curve somewhere. So 1 mana enchantment, at the beginning of your end step, Flare Blitz deals 5 damage to each planeswalker. So basically this is just, if you're in a meta where your playgroup or your opponents are playing a lot of planeswalkers, this is going to ruin their day. This is a 1 mana enchantment that just murders a lot of planeswalkers straight up, and if not, will like send them back to the Stone Age in terms of loyalty. And like, I don't think there's a single planeswalker that will realistically be able to take 2 hits from this. Without going down. Now, a lot of planeswalkers can like solve this card, right, by destroying it themselves, but you're still probably going to dome all the planeswalkers with 5 damage, and like that's pretty good. And then again, it's even nice because it has that sort of like bail you out mode of you can cycle it away if you're not playing against opponents that are running planeswalkers, or like your friend who has a planeswalker deck isn't playing it in this pod. And so you can just cycle away, and later you can use it against them when they bust out the Planeswalker deck. Like, I think it's a very flexible card with a pretty powerful effect. It's not going to go in every red deck or anything, but meta dependent, this could be a very strong card. Flametongue Yearling is obviously a cute throwback to Flametongue Kavu, but I think that it is substantially worse than the Kavu. And I would just play Kavu instead. Even Kabu's kind of getting power crept out of the format a little bit. No, not completely. I definitely think Kabu is still a very reasonable card in many decks. But yeah, just play Flametongue Kabu. Don't play Flametongue Yearling. Fury is our black elemental incarnation. It is one of the better ones, but I still believe that it is ultimately not particularly good for Commander. The card that this one is referencing is Pyrokinesis. And this was actually a pretty closely direct reference because Pyrokinesis actually does allow you to also pitch cast this itself. It's like it's like a 5. I think Pyrokinesis is like a 5 or 6 mana card with the same ETB effect as a spell. But the bottom line is that, yeah, like a 5 mana 3/3 double strike it's a fine body, don't get me wrong. But like in Commander, it doesn't really stack up that much. Like it's not great. And the enter the battlefield, deal 4 damage, divide as you choose is again a fine ability, but not terribly exciting. I think it is probably like the second or third most playable of the incarnations for Commander, with Solitude being like in a league of its own in terms of like being extremely playable, I think, which is nice to honestly see White get the best version of the cycle for once. I don't love this card though. I think it's playable, and again, I'm not going to fault you for doing it, but I'm not in love with it. Let's see. Moving on. I guess I should briefly talk about Galvanic Relay, just because again, it's a pretty unique ability. It does have Storm. So 3 mana, exile the top card of your library. During your next turn, you may play that card. So it's a little bit different from usual cards like this, where you're saying until the end of your next turn. This one literally only lets you play it next turn. You cannot play it this turn, period. But on your next turn, you get to play it anytime you want. And it also has Storm. So obviously, ideally, you want to build into this card, right? You want to cast 2-3 more other cards first to exile multiple cards off the top of your library and get to play a lot of them next turn, maybe, hopefully. But again, it's just like, it just feels like it's like 3 mana is very clunky as like being like your having the 4th spell or even 3rd spell in a turn cost 3 mana is like pretty inefficient. Like, how much mana do you have that you were able to cast many more spells before your 3 mana spells? I don't know. And then even then, once you get to do that, you're still on a 1-turn delay, right? So you don't even get to continue going off this turn with the cards you're exiling. You have to wait till next turn to go again. It could be okay, and again, the Storm mechanic should not be underestimated, but I don't think this is it. So Glimpse of Tomorrow is this one is a slightly different, because whereas all these other cards so far have been like direct analogies of another card, this one is slightly modified in that this one is a modification on Warp World, which is like, I think, an 8 mana spell that says each player shuffles all permanents they own into their library, then reveals that many cards from the top of their library, and then they put all permanent cards revealed this way onto the battlefield. This one does that, but only for you. So it's a personal Warp World on Suspend 3 for red. I have no idea how good this card is, legitimately. I do not know if this card is good or not. It's cheap for the effect, but sometimes the part of the upside of Warp World is you're screwing over your opponent's stuff as well and forcing them to just kind of start over at random. If it's just you and you brick, because sometimes Warp World doesn't work out. But in this case, it's only you who's taking the risk, which means that if it doesn't pay off for you, your opponents are still just doing their thing, and they've been completely unaffected by this. So this might just be 2 mana Suspend 3, lose the game sometimes, where you like sewer yourself as this like resolves, and your opponents are still just chilling. I don't think it's good, but it is a fun card, and I would love to see somebody or hear from somebody who like got to cast this and did something really cool with it. But I'm not excited for it. Next up is Harmonic Prodigy. It's a 2 mana 1/3 human wizard with prowess. And it's essentially a Panharmonicon specifically for shamans and wizards. So yeah, if you want your shamans and wizards to trigger their abilities twice, this is a really cool card. If you do not care about shamans and wizards, then we don't care. And that's that. The next one is Obsidian Charma, a 5-mana 4/4 flyer. It's a dragon. When it enters the battlefield, you destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls, which is pretty sweet. So it's like, you know, kind of an Avalanche Riders-esque ability, right? ETB, blow up a land. This one does have to be non-basic. I actually kind of forget if Avalanche Riders is as well, but either way, non-basic land, but there's infinite of those running around in Commander, so we know that you're always going to have a target for this. The really cool part, though, is in the cost reduction, where this spell costs 1 less to cast for each lands your opponents control that could produce a colorless mana. So that doesn't mean it has to, but if it has anywhere, so like, for example, like the classic example of this would be like the Pain lands, right? The ones that can tap for either colorless or can tap for one of 2 colors and pay a life. Or maybe it's take a damage. I'm forgetting off the top of my head. But any land that could produce colorless, even if it has another mode or another thing, will help discount this. And all it needs is 3 among 3 opponents. And like, I would wager in most scenarios that your opponents are there is going to be a total, like more than 3 lands that your opponents control at any given point that will reduce this down to just red. And if you're paying red for a 4/4 flyer that blows up a land when it enters the battlefield, notably the very land that helped reduce the cost could also end up being the target of this card when it enters, to kind of add insult to injury or whatever, or I guess injury to insult. But yeah, if you're paying red for a 4/4 flyer that blows up a land when it enters, that is a fantastic deal. And honestly, if you're paying 1 red for that effect, you're still in great shape. This card will never cost 5 mana, and if it costs 3 or less, then you are doing fantastic. 4 is like probably like the middle ground case on it, where it's like fine but not particularly exciting. But 3 or less is just like ridiculous, because like it all, like it's good early or late. Like because even if it's like you're casting this on turn 7, what it means is you can cast it for 2 mana and then still cast a 5 mana spell, and you still get a 4/4 dragon with an ETB ability. Like, it's a good card. I think this card is really, really good. And is really good. And again, if you're playing in the meta where people have their Gaia's Cradles and Cabal Coffers and Field of the Dead and like Maze of Ith and whatever else, like all these problematic utility lands that you just get to blow up and get a good body in the process. Ragavan, Nimble Pilfer. I'm excited about this card. This card is cool. This card is really, really cool. So Ragavan, Nimble Pilfer is a 1 mana 2/1 legendary creature monkey pirate, which is fantastic. Just already, we're loving this. So of course, for anyone who played during, oh my god, help me, I'm blanking. Bloody hell. The set with artifacts that was vaguely Indian themed. Oh my god. Kaladesh, there we go. That took way too long. For anyone who played Kaladesh, you'll remember Kari Zev, who would attack and make a Ragavan token whenever she attacked. So this is just Ragavan going solo. I don't know if they've parted ways or if people just like Ragavan so much that he just got his own card. But either way, here he is in all of his 1 mana, or in all of his 2/1 glory. And whenever he attacks, whenever he deals combination with a player, you get to create a treasure token and exile the top card of that player's library. Until next turn, you may cast that card. So if he ever hits your opponent, you get a treasure, and that one's yours to keep for however long you need it. And you get to, until the end of your next turn, which again is nice because it means that even if you spend a bunch of mana this turn, you still have next turn to potentially cast that card. You get to steal some stuff from them. So it's, he's doing pirate things. He gets treasure and steals stuff from your opponent. Honestly, I think this card is a freaking home run. I think this card is amazing flavor, fantastic flavor. It's also very cheap. So like, even though it's not a heavy hitter in Commander, the effect is cheap. And notably, it's very much helped by the fact that it has dash. Because the dash mechanic is actually grabbed from the Khans of Tarkir set, or block anyway. I think it is set. I think dash was just the Mardu mechanic. And you basically get to play it for 2 mana, but it has haste, and then you bring it back to your hand at the end of turn. So you basically get to kind of literally dash it out, kind of surprise attack them, because they weren't expecting to need to block, so they didn't have a blocker up. You get to like grab a treasure, grab a card off of them, and bring it back to your hand safe and sound. I think this card is super duper fun. I don't know what decks exactly want this card per se. I mean, certainly any pirate tribal deck is going to be drooling over this, but like, Ragavan is going to slip in for some random damage and get some value when you least expect it. And I think it's just a very, very, very fun card. And I'm excited to play both with and against it. On we go. Ooh, speaking of cheap cards that make treasure, I think Strike It Rich is actually a really, really good card. I know people in Modern are excited about this card, but I think it's actually quite good for Commander too. It's essentially a weird ritual on like a time delay where you're spending a mana to make a mana, but that's like it's mana that you get to keep in your little jar, right? It's a treasure, so you get to keep it on board for later, and so you're sort of like paying it forward, quite literally in the case of it being treasure. You're paying it forward, and it has flashbacks, so like you're getting to do it again. So obviously 3 mana to make 1 treasure is bad, but it's free because you're not spending an extra card to do it. It's just stapled onto this card that already exists. And if you have anything that cares about casting non-creature spells, right, any prowess triggers, whenever you cast an instant sorcery type triggers, like, then you're just getting extra gravy for doing a thing that's already pretty decent. So again, this kind of falls under the same category as the crab card from blue that I was talking about much earlier, the one that made a clue and a crab. It's a cog piece. It's super, super cheap. It impacts the board, albeit in a minor way, but it's that cheap enabler for like all of these random synergies that help you do other things. I'm definitely very excited for this card, and I think this card is quite the solid little cog piece in your synergy engines, which is my favorite kind of Magic to play. There's Tavern Scoundrel, which is a really weird card, but kind of a fun one. Not really my style of card, but I'd be remiss to not mention it because I know that a lot of people, this is 100% your cup of tea. So 1 in a red for a 1/3. Whenever you win a coin flip, create 2 treasure tokens. So of course, this goes well in your Krark commander decks and your oh my goodness, oh god, the partners from, not from Conspiracy, from Battle Bond. It's like the ogre. It's like an ogre and a homunculus or whatever. I'm forgetting their names right now. It's not Fibblethip. That's what my brain keeps trying to say. Fibblethip. That's probably not it. Anyway, if you've got coin flip commander deck, this is a cool card for that, because if you win a flip, you just get 2 treasures on the house, right? And of course, just because you don't want to rely on other cards necessarily, it does have the ability to flip coins itself. So you sack another permanent, flip a coin. So there's a bit of like a kind of like paying it back in a little bit, where like if you ever win a coin flip, you get 2 treasures, then you can basically sack one of the treasures to pay for the ability, and then sack the other treasure as the cost, flip a coin, and if you win, you get your treasures back again. Which is sort of like buying into that gambler's fallacy of like, oh, but I won. It's like, yeah, but you have to pay to win. It's like, anyway, I enjoy the flavor of the card, and if you are just flipping coins elsewhere, this is actually just going to generate value for you 50% of the time. This is going to give you 2 treasures, which is pretty cool. Moving on. Okay, we're done with the new cards in red. I do quickly just want to mention its Chance Encounter, just because it has a new artwork, which I think is really cool. But B, this card was very much in need of a reprint because it had been getting weirdly expensive because of how unique and weird and effective it is. So I'm very, very glad to see this card be reprinted and with cool new art.